welcome to the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce's Infrastructure Projects in Brazil, Opportunities and Challenges for Investors webinar. The Investment Partnership Program, the PPI, has launched a new stage of infrastructure projects and ramping up the granting of long-term concessions to private companies to operate airports, ports, highways, railways, oil and gas and production, and power generation and distribution. The program also entails privatizing state-owned corporations and the sale of other public sector assets. Brazilian states have also established projects to attract investment and grant concessions in addition to extensive use of public-private partnerships in the operation of hospitals, prisons, and data centers. The Brazilian National Development Bank, Development and Social Development Bank, BNDES, in addition to underwriting investment projects, is now acting as an advisor to federal, state, and local governments in structuring these initiatives.
Hello, John. Many thanks for your introduction. Now I kindly ask Montezano, Marta, and Carol to take in this moment of the opening remarks to say a few words before we present our first question to them. Montezano, can you be the first one, please?
Sure, Rafael. Rafael, Carolina, thank you very much for the invitation. John and all the American Chamber team, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you again. The outcome of this COVID crisis and the long-term structuring and investments and Brazilian growth will be based on infrastructure.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for this invitation. 2021 is the year of the auctions here in Brazil for infrastructure and also for privatizations. We have worked a lot in 2019 and 2020 to structure all those opportunities, even though 2020 was such a difficult year for all of us. But it didn't stop us from moving forward with feasibility studies analysis on a very important portfolio of projects. So that's why 2021 has so much to offer. We were in B3 last week in São Paulo with Minister Tarcísio, with many important transportation projects for auction, 22 airports, 5 different port terminals, and also very important railway. So we called it the Infrastructure Week, the Infra Week. And we went to São Paulo with some critics on should we be moving forward with auctions in this moment, knowing all the effects and impacts of COVID-19 on demand for some infrastructures. Airports, as an example, have suffered a lot with this health crisis. But we left the auction very happy of the number of players we saw. We had more than 7 players for the airports, as an example, the consortiums. And coming from different countries, we had 4 different countries, and with very important bids that represent that Brazil has a lot to offer and that investors are believing in the growth of our country.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to host you here together with Rafael and John.
2020 was a challenging year, especially due to the COVID-19, but even so, the year of the biggest investments from the BNDES into the domestic market. After a turbulent year, how's the bank position for 2021 and 2022?
We want and we will and we are working on reducing the barrier of entry for new players in Brazil, making the level playing field more fair for either new entrants, could be smaller players that are growing in Brazil, financial players, or international players that are willing to come to Brazil. Firstly, and that's something we've been doing for the last 2 years in a very intensive mode at BNDES, was improving the quality of projects in Brazil. That's why we set up and put in place what we call the BNDES Project Factories. It's like an investment banking service that works both for the federal level and for states in Brazil. Looking forward, we still see massive opportunities for decades of bringing projects to the market. Going to the financing side, we still have the same philosophy: opening for market, opening for competition. For many years, BNDES has been fighting for market share against public banks, against private lenders. and we are reversing 180 degrees in this strategy. We do want to syndicate. We do want to co-finance and to collaborate with additional lenders in Brazil. It can be domestic, banks, capital markets, international players, multilateral banks. We do want to share our knowledge and our resource in order to have a good syndication of lenders in Brazil. The main goal there is that we can reach the project finance strict sensus structure in Brazil. For many reasons, historically, BNDES in Brazil didn't step in the risk project industry. We still work with based on standby letter of credits, based on corporate guarantees, and that's a bottleneck to increasing and growing the size of the financing market for projects in Brazil. Together, we are willing and we can assume and take more risks, more project risks than if you are a single lender.
Marta, as you mentioned, last week we had the Infra Week in Brazil. What the PPI is foreseen from a strategic point of view to expand upon the infrastructure projects in the coming 2 years or more ahead? What do you expect to be the defining trends for investments in the years ahead?
But the portfolio is huge. We also have very important portfolio with oil and gas and energy generation and transmission. We have smaller projects, but still very important to show that we're diversifying the portfolio with PPPs on national parks to attract investors for developing tourism with sustainability, national forests, fishery terminals. Even this year, we already have an auction of a fishery terminal in Brazil. The mining agenda is moving very fast as well. And each time more, we try to help the states and municipalities in Brazil, as Montezano said, with all the knowledge the federal government has and also our federal banks to help them structure PPPs and privatizations in different sectors. And one sector that needs to be highlighted right now in Brazil is sanitation, because we're having a big transformation in that sector that also that needed a lot historically of public investments. And recently we had a change in law that opened the doors for private investments. And since then we've been helping the states and municipalities with very important projects. And this month, the 30th April, will be in São Paulo together with Montezano, together with the governor of Rio, to have the auction of SEDAI, the company of sanitation of Rio de Janeiro, a very important project.
On how you see PPPs in the federal project, because we know that the federal government has been trying to put together PPPs for infrastructure projects, but many of them, the studies revealed that they were not eligible for PPPs because they could be feasible on common concessions. So you mentioned that the privatization of the Santos port would involve a PPP. Could you please further explain how do you see the feasibility and suitability of PPPs in infrastructure projects from the federal government?
So for the federal government, we don't have many PPPs in the sense that we need to add budget from the government to make the project viable. Most part of our projects are viable considering tariffs of the services that are provided in those infrastructures, and also additional revenues. When we consider airports, for example, you have so many additional revenues from parking, from hotels, from restaurants, and all that. So we design all the project considering the possibilities of revenues to understand how viable it is in the long term and how we can add all the capex needed to face the growth of demand during many years. If demand rises more than we had forecasted, then you have this trigger of investment and the concessionaire has to start a new cycle of investments. So we try to make all those contracts very flexible so that we focus on the service and not so much in being predictable on all the investments that will need to be done in such a long period of decades.
Naturally, we always prefer to privatization, so it's the first option, of course. Second, the concessions, and PPP will be the third option. And as we see today, and especially after the crisis we're living now, If you see the fiscal status of both federal level and states, we are all tight. So in order to structure PPP, the critical cornerstone there is how do you guarantee, how do you collateralize the payment from the public side? And having said that, that's why we didn't see yet a big increase in PPP landscape in Brazil in the last years. And I'll be surprised if in the upcoming years we see a big ramp in the amount, in the quantity of PPPs across Brazil.
Montezano, you said that the BNDES now has a role of how can I say, exclude the barrier for the foreign investments and etc. and structure good projects and etc. Can you develop more with regards how BNDES can help foreign investors to come to Brazil instructing this project, and how do you see this role in the near future of the bank?
And how can we help new investors, either domestic or international? Information, quality of products. That's why seeing BNDES not only as a financing machine, but also some place, some institution where you can create solutions, where you can find information, where you can articulate debates and ideas across the Brazilian infrastructure market is critical. Brazil has been moving towards a complete renovation of its philosophy on infrastructure. Our philosophy today is based on 3 pillars. First is the fiscal discipline. Keep the interest rates at I would say, single digital levels. Second is good regulation. For example, what we did in sanitation, electricity, gas, cabotage, ports. We're seeing a complete revolution in the regulations in Brazil across industry. And the third pillar is, again, good projects, good modeling.
We've been dialoguing a lot with investors that are already here. So we try to make the whole environment better all the time. All the contracts, we need them to get better on time. So each auction, we try to learn from what has happened, what worked, and what could have been made better. Understanding also how the contract then follows the years of the concession. So it's a constant dialogue with investors that are here. And this dialogue, for an example, now in coronavirus situation, helped us bring rapid solutions for rebalancing the contracts and making sure services could be provided, and we didn't have problems with those investors, even in difficult situations such as the airport. So all our airport concessionaires had rebalancing of their contracts, so they wouldn't respond for a risk that is not theirs. And this is very important also in the structuring of projects in Brazil. We designed the risks, the matrix of risks in each contract very carefully to make sure that investors don't have to answer for things that they don't administrate. So if you have a health crisis, or if you have any issue that your insurance won't be sufficient to cover, then you can count on the contract to have rebalances and not to lose money here in Brazil. Besides that, we are working on demand risks in different projects. So for highways, for example, we need to bring more investors to Brazil in this sector since the portfolio is so huge and we don't have as many players as in airports, for example. So we've been developing new regulations inside the contracts so that we can mitigate the demand risk, so that we can mitigate FX risk. That's something new as well for investors that have their loans in another currency. For highways, we have developed a new solution so that part of the payments that would go to the government go to a different account, like an escrow account, so that we can mitigate FX risks. Legal certainty of the contracts, that's something very important. Brazil respects contracts, and that is something that investors need to know when they come to Brazil. And I would end saying about how ESG our portfolio is, because this is something also that has been attracting very important players from abroad and huge players. So when we talk about the sanitation portfolio, that's the top ESG project you can have, because of course you have great impact on the environment when you're not polluting anymore, but also great social impact on the lives of people and children. So our energy generation projects are very green. Even our railroad projects are considered green. And we had the French group that won the airports of the North last week that said that one reason why he invested so highly, let's say, in Brazil, is that he considers he can make green airports in the Amazon. So we have a very important portfolio of ESG projects.
A few months ago, we saw the need of splitting this department. So we have now what we call the traditional project modeling, ports, toll roads, sanitation, the big financial investments. And now we have a second department for modeling as well, which you call the social environmental projects. For example, creches, kindergartens, prisons, hospitals, parks, forests, all these social and environmental projects that they by itself, they are not so relevant when you see an individual investments on a financial perspective, but they have the potential to completely change the landscape of those industry in Brazil. Let's take, for example, the parks, as Marta also mentioned before. We have in our portfolio today 36 parks that we are going to concession to the market. Foz do Iguaçu, Jalapão, Ibitipoca, and we have 30 others across Brazil. When you look at those investments, financial, they are tiny, 5 million, 10 million, 2 million reais. But when you look at the potential of how they can change the ecotourism in Brazil, how they can change the cities, the countryside cities in Brazil, and make the territory development there, it's a landmark change in the sector in Brazil. And there is no separation anymore about non-ESG products or ESG products. Either you have a proper ESG model project or you don't have a project.
One important thing we had to do is to understand how the crisis was impacting demand and each sector that we were structuring. So we realized very fast that for the ports, for example, it didn't seem to have a great impact. On the contrary, since we are having a very important production of grains in Brazil and we're exporting so much, we had growth in our ports. So we didn't need to come back to the feasibility numbers when we were talking about port projects. On the other hand, of course, the airports were very affected. So we needed to understand, basically in the first years of the project, how we needed to diminish some of the demand forecast and consequently some of the investments that needed to be done. But when we look at the long term, it didn't affect so much the project. It's more on rebalancing the obligations in the first years of the contracts than the long term.
Yeah, naturally, when you look at the volatility of BRL, that's a reality. We live a sanitary crisis, right? Brazil is going under a big leverage on the fiscal balance, and not only here in Latin America, but looking at emerging markets globally, we're going to you tend. I'm not sure that will happen, but it tends to be a more volatile environment in the emerging markets currency, right? And looking backwards, this is a risk that foreign investors playing on the infra market in Brazil should be hedging or measuring. And looking forward, the good news to say on that is that BRL is now at 5.7, so the valuation was relevant in Brazil. And as I always say, if you're here to invest for 30 years, 25, 40 years, the best hedge you should try to use is leveraging your projects in BRL based. So your USD exposure will be very, very diminished, right? And then you'll be here for 34 years, where this volatility, the short-term volatility of the currency is diminished, right?
Thank you very much, Rafael. Thank you, Martha, Carolina, and Gustavo, also for a
you.
really excellent discussion. Really excellent.